Hi everyone, my name is Trisha Danforth. I am the Program and Exhibit Manager here at Nordic Northwest. I'm addressing all of you in the audience, and then we have a live stream going as well. So there are people watching that you can't see. We're really excited to have James here today to do this talk on sustainable landscape design. This is kind of the first time that we've had something quite like this. So we're really excited that all of you are here and able to join us. James is the owner and lead designer of Garden Stories, and he is a licensed landscape designer. So we're going to learn all about all of his knowledge, and then afterwards there's going to be a question and answer section. So feel free to ask any and all of your questions. And without further ado, I'll let James step up here.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Trisha. You guys can just hear my voice, and I think the microphone is for the live stream. This talk is loosely about sustainable landscape design. That's just what lured you in. It's really just, I'm going to talk about some ideas first, and then we'll get more into like specifics, and I'll show you pretty pictures of plants and things like that, because I'm sure everyone wants to see stuff like that. And then we'll have a short question answer period at the end, if people want that. Would people want to have a little question and answer? Okay. So I'm assuming the live stream isn't able to do questions, or they can do it? Okay. Okay, so without further ado, make sure everyone's comfortable in the right place. Okay, so this talk, I did previous talk at Hortlandia this year, and so I've modified it slightly, but hopefully no one was there, because they're going to get this repeat talk. So this, does anyone know what this image is here? What we're looking at here? So this is a like remnant oak savanna ecology. This is actually, there's a small little natural area around like Westland area. And so if around springtime, like maybe May, you can go and you can see kind of a remnant oak ecology, and just a reminder of kind of what the Willamette Valley used to consist of. So this is a pretty picture, but we're also just going to talk about other types of nature as well, and also about creating our own gardens. So just some of the ideas, like I said, just kind of have to entertain me. I like to talk about ideas. This is an opportunity for me to flesh out some of the ideas that the ways I've thought about landscape design, horticulture, and nature in general have shifted and evolved over time. And so also this is about kind of adaptation. We're not going to get into like talking about climate change. I'm not going to try to like depress you. But we need to think about gardens as places of change, and part of having more resilience in our own gardens is thinking about them a little bit differently. So these are just some of the ideas we're going to talk about. Urban spaces are landscapes of change, so they're essentially, we can look at them as places where there's more flux in the environment, and part of that is the human landscape. Humans and nature. So we often think these are kind of two different things, but this is a false dichotomy. We're all part of nature. Not freaking out. That's an important concept in our age of anxiety. Not freaking out is important. So, and gardens are really places that we can relax, and they should be places where we find solace in. And part of my experience as a gardener, before I became a landscape designer was just a connection to the land. When I first, my background is in environmental studies and environmental science, and I used to work as like a field botanist, and I had a much more abstract relationship with nature, and so it was quantifying and it was sampling, and but it wasn't until I started actually working in gardens that I formed a more intimate relationship with plants and with the natural world. So and it allowed me a place where I could really calm my mind, and often gardening is a place where we just get out kind of the stress of the day. So native plants, we're going to talk about native plants. My views about native plants have shifted and evolved. I'm a big advocate of native plants, but I'm not a dogmatist. So and we can also talk about what is a native plant and how we define that when it comes to horticulture, and when it comes to this field of landscape design. Climate adapted, that's and climate proof, that's probably going to be a new buzzword. So when we talk about climate adapted, it just means that plants that are more resilient to extremes, extremes in temperature, extremes in drought. Oaks are one of my favorite trees, and really a tree that defines the West Coast in general, but defines the Willamette Valley. And a very resilient tree, very resilient plant or genus. And then plant communities in our gardens, and when we talk about plant communities, we usually are thinking about in an ecological sense in the natural world, but I think about when I'm designing spaces, sometimes of thinking about a community of plants that have a certain kind of feel and that feel authentic to that place. And lastly, plant selection, because beauty does matter, and we'll show you some pretty pictures towards the end. So this is more the idea phase of the talk, and so just talk a little bit about kind of my ideas about nature, and then how I kind of think about gardens in that sense. So how will we adapt to a changing environment and a changing climate as gardeners? And I scoured the internet for some fun little images here to throw in with you. So again, I don't do a lot of presentations, and as a gardener or horticulturalist or landscape designer, you spend a lot of time on your own. And so this is a way for me to kind of like explore those ideas that we were talking about. So anyways, we'll talk a little bit about that. So adaptive environments, the landscape of change. This is on a trip in Germany. Actually, I took this photo. It really resonated with me. This is a Jewish cemetery in Worms. I don't know if anyone's ever been here before, but it's a really cool space because for me it has all these elements that I think about. It has like the passage of time, which I think is really cool. You can see the headstones like in different phases of having the effects of gravity. And then it's a natural space, but it's wild, but it's also managed. It has cultural value. Obviously, it probably has a fair amount of wildlife value. It's a really interesting. It's really a mix of all these different things going on, and so this is what I'm talking about when we're viewing nature. Nature exists essentially everywhere, but the way we can perceive it sometimes can be different. And so something really drew me to this this image, and so I wanted to share that with you guys. So the Anthropocene. So does anyone know what the Anthropocene is? our
The Anthropocene is the last couple hundred years where some people call it the Anthropocene because it's where humans have had an oversight impact on the planet.
yes. We'll see if that definition lines up with. No, that is correct. Yeah, we as human beings are the dominant form on this planet, and we have essentially changed the planet in a way that we have essentially, we can define it as a new era. So yeah, this is the current definition. The current geological age, viewed as a period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. And this isn't to be depressing. This is just a reality. This is and this is also when we're again thinking about nature, we can think about it in different ways. And so anyways, I just wanted to kind of bring in this idea. This is part of a new way to kind of look at the world, I think. So I have a lot of travel shots. This is this is a golf course in Mexico. And sometimes I'll see an area and I'll just be like, something about that is really interesting to me. And I don't know, maybe this is the vines and the arch and the palm LA, but this is kind of an environment where there's a lot of things going on. And so there's man-made, there's human-made things, and there's natural elements, and then there's, obviously planted palms to define a more formal space. And so the human landscape is essentially an environment in flux and in change. And this is what I'm talking about, the adaptive environment. So the idea that, nature is this pretty area that we go hiking out, and then, we come back to a city or a home, and they're two different worlds. That's, I would say, a construct that we've created, and because there's really no definition of what nature is, because it's anywhere. So part of kind of embracing the Anthropocene is saying that nature isn't just the pretty picture. And so some of these ideas that we talk about are adaptive ecologies or novel ecosystems. So it's really just about kind of environments that have natural elements, have maybe a mix of native plants. In my gardens, that I create for clients, there's a lot of native plants, but then there's also non-native ornamentals, things that maybe are adapted to a site in a better way than a native plant would be. And we'll also get into more about wildlife and adaptive organisms. So this, crows, jays, bears, beetles, honeybees, these are all creatures that thrive in an adaptive environment, just like we do, just like, human beings. And so that's when we think about kind of creating gardens and looking at our spaces, we can kind of think about these are areas that are in flux, but we can also invite in the kind of creatures that exist in those areas that thrive in those environments. And we can, improve them as well. So does anyone know what this is? Actually, I have a little note on there. So this is, you're looking at an apartment building in Paris. Another one of my travel photos. This is a travel blog. So this is a living wall, a vertical wall. Probably one of the more remarkable ones you see. Usually you'll see them. You can see them around in the Portland area. But this is Patrick Blanc's. He's kind of a world-renowned designer and quite remarkable. So this is right in the middle of Paris. And I'm sure this brings all kinds of ecological value to this neighborhood. And I'm sure there's all kinds of organisms that exist in it because it's so diverse. There's so many plants in that space. So things like this started to change my views on what nature could be. Does anyone know what this is? Yes, this is the Highline. So this is before it had been developed. And so I just think this is such a incredible. So this was the inspiration for the Highline, is that people knew that this area existed. And, you know...
Could you explain what the Highline is?
Yeah. Okay, so the Highline is now a park. So it used to be an old elevated train rail. And it had been abandoned for a long time since the subway was developed. But essentially it was this, abandoned elevated space that had started essentially to be taken back by sense. And so all these plants that exist in this space, those are what we would actually call like weeds or invasive plants. And, I used to work on removing invasive eradication, and I'd get this like hatred towards invasive plants, whatever. But I see them differently now. You could argue that invasive plants are a way that nature is trying to heal the wound that essentially that is scarred by our, industrious mode of development. So this was essentially kind of the space before it was developed, and so now the Highline looks like this, and it's incredible, beautiful, but it started out as just essentially an abandoned space that nature was slowly kind of taking back. And so this is actually a newer space. This is in San Francisco. This is like Chrissy Field area in the Presidio. So like the Golden Gate Bridge is like over here. This is relatively new. I actually haven't been. I've just heard about it. But this is essentially they call this tunnel tops, and this is sitting above one of the main tunnels for essentially like the 101 highway to come into San Francisco from the Golden Gate Bridge. So they're creating really a really kind of a new ecological space that is both for plants and animals and also for human beings. And so I think that's really important when we are thinking about spaces, is that we're trying to create spaces not just for plants and organisms and not just for human beings, but for all of us together. And I think environments like this are a way to kind of embrace that, embrace the Anthropocene. But I used to work in the Presidio a while back, and we did restoration projects, not quite at this scale. This is the next level. This is the same design as that, actually. So I'm looking forward to visiting this, and I encourage other people to as well. So this is just the current model of where we're going as a society. Just levity in here. I don't know how this got in here, but okay. So I really love this shot. I call this like meadow bathing. In Japan, they have a term. I don't know what it is, but it's essentially called forest bathing. And I don't know. This is, I feel like, should be a requirement maybe in like early child education or something. But just to like, I don't know when the last time anyone has ever just gone out to a meadow and laid down and maybe stared up at the sky. But it's just important kind of experiences to immerse ourselves into the natural world, because it's very healing. And especially in our age, I think we need this more and more. And it's just another way to hammer home this point that I keep hammering home, which is that we are not separate. We are all a part of nature. Okay, so we're going to now shift into more specifics and talk about native plants. And I'm going to talk to you about some of my ideas about native plants and how we can use them in our gardens. So what is a native plant? Really kind of depends on the context of if we're talking about native plants in a natural area and like a restoration site, like on a lake in the Cascades, or if we're talking about our backyard, talking about our gardens in our in residential areas or in cities. And you can have a loose definition or you can have a tight definition, and I often say that kind of might say something about you as a person. I tend to have a bit loose definition of what a native plant is, and that has shifted too, and I think I was a bit more dogmatic when I was younger about what native plants were. Part of thinking about these adaptive environments is that we have to start thinking a little bit more broadly about what native means. And also that these are just categories, and plants and animals are really essentially not categorizable. They don't really define themselves, so it's all, human constructs. But yeah, native plants, one of the most important reasons that I use native plants is connecting people to a place that's often. I'll work with clients that are maybe not from Oregon and not from the Northwest, and so and they want to understand our region here, and so incorporating some native plants into their garden is a way for them to kind of get a sense of the local ecology and just the feel and the look of what this region is. But yeah, so it is connecting us to an authentic place. The hard truth is not all natives are useful in our gardens. Some really, really resent being disturbed. So often, I don't know if people know what a madrone tree is. Really hard to establish in your garden. There's quite a few plants like that don't like to be contained, don't like to have their roots confined, don't like to be watered in the summer, just the side of a hose, they're just gonna up and die. So these aren't good suitors for more, again, areas that are more in flux. And so in our gardens, I would say this if you have acreage, or if maybe you live in an urban interface where you're surrounded by natural area, that's then you can probably grow things that are more specific to that area. But so I just tend to say in urban, maybe you have a tight space and it gets really hot, and there's going to be a right plant for that place, but it's going to be a very limited palette. So native plant arrogance. Yeah, this is something I've come across. There's a lot we don't understand about our world, so I run up against the Audubon Society people a lot, and because they're a bit dogmatic for my taste. But part of that is just being humble about what we know and what we don't know, and so don't be arrogant about your native plants. So we're gonna talk a little bit about kind of what our region is. And so this image here, this is actually really cool to see. This gives you a sense of what the Willamette Valley used to consist of. So the dark green in that is what we would think of as mostly conifer forest. But part of that region is either that lighter color or the savanna. Prairie is just grassland. Savanna would be like oak savanna with mostly grassland with oaks dotted around. So 1850s or so, most of the Willamette Valley was actually not dug fir, but mostly grassland, wetlands, and then oak savanna. And one of my favorite, that's why I started that image in the beginning, that first slide, is that's probably my favorite ecotype, is oak savanna. I would love to like have a remnant, a piece of oak savanna that I could cultivate and live on. But there's very few patches of it left. Most of it has been developed. But it was also, this is a fire adapted environment. So it's not just that we developed this all, but by suppressing fire, that encouraged more dug fir growth, and then they would kind of shade out all the oaks and stuff. So anyways, just something to think about when you think about what the Pacific Northwest looks like. People think of dug fir trees, and probably because a lot of that is when we go hiking in the mountains and stuff. But this whole region essentially was much more of an oak-dominated landscape. So this is just a range of our native oaks, Quercus garryana. And so as you can see, it's, you know, all through the Willamette Valley and all the way down into Northern California. This is that more of that like first image on a different shot with the camas. And then this is what we have now, mostly, which is one oak tree surrounded by probably like a grass seed farm. That's often when I'm driving back to like where I grew up in Sweden, that's the landscape that I see. So just checking on time. Okay, so West Coast native southern expansion. So these are some plants that you could think about when you're thinking about maybe wanting to incorporate some native plants that are native to this region. But plants don't stay in one space, and their ranges have changed over time. And so these are the kind of things that will probably be more successful as the climate warms up. And so tan oaks and canyon oaks, but also the manzanitas, ceanothus, and I'll show you some really pretty pictures as we go. But I'm just kind of showing you the ranges of these areas. And so this is what they define as the California floristic province. That goes all the way up into southern Oregon. So that's like a lot of chaparral, essentially a dry climate and a dry summer climate. And so as our summers get hotter and drier, a lot of the plants from these regions are going to be really successful in our region, especially in the Willamette Valley. And as I just demonstrated, the Willamette Valley was mostly an oak savanna region, and oaks thrive in hot, dry summers, long dry summers type of environment. Probably the number one thing people ask me when they want a garden, they're thinking about planting a new garden. The number one top request probably is wildlife. And so I want hummingbirds, or, you know, want generally birds, but also, you know, bees, or just things for so when I'm thinking about creating a new garden, I think about things that would attract our native hummingbirds, bees, all kinds of different organisms. So, but obviously, like, having hummingbirds out your window is something that pretty much anyone can appreciate, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. What I like to say is just inviting our relatives over and offering them food and drink. So having a little space for water, having a water element is an important part of creating a wildlife garden. So whether it's just, maybe like a bird bath or an actual water feature. And then having plants that will be attracted to and either offer nectar or pollen to birds and bees. And then forage as well. So, something when we're thinking about gardens and maintaining them is I try to tell people leave as much forage and, don't deadhead everything because all those deadheads are seeds and things for insects and birds to forage on. Water, I just talked about that. Okay, so plant selection criteria. So we're going to get into more specifics here. So climate adapted. So is it adapted to? So one thing is that when I talk about climate adapted, often people don't understand what our climate is, what it has been, and so from a horticultural perspective, the Northwest has kind of had a love affair with Asia and with the Japanese garden, and but it actually has a much different climate than we have. They have warm, humid summers, and we have warm, dry summers. So climate adapted is not just like, a changing climate, a hotter climate, but also like what our actual climate is, which is essentially a modified Mediterranean climate where we have 3 months dry, but it can be even longer because now, as we see, most of October was dry this year. So understanding our climate is important when you're thinking about selecting plants. Site conditions. So just, is it a south-facing slope? I had a client, she loved ferns, and she loved essentially like, a forest floor. And she had a southwest-facing slope. So she got south, midday sun, and all afternoon sun. And I was like, you might want to explore some plants that are going to thrive in this space versus plants that you have a connection to personally, and that you might be surprised about what kind of plants you like, but a thriving garden is most important. So thinking about the specific site conditions is always an important part of plant selection. Wildlife value, is it going to contribute any, nectar, pollen? Is it going to be something that will either attract attract insects or birds, or provide them some kind of forage or nesting? So just thinking about wildlife value is obviously an important criteria. Aesthetics and season of interest. Again, sometimes a purely native garden is going to go dormant so quickly that it's not going to have a long season of interest. So having some plants that are going to have year-round interest is an important part of just creating a nice landscape design. We want to create spaces that are appealing to us and that we're drawn to, and so thinking about this environment as interest for us as well as human beings and what we're drawn to. Does it relate to other plants in your garden? So sometimes thinking about a garden is that plants from the same kind of climate region can look like they belong together, and then plants that are from maybe different requirements, they kind of can clash. So and often I'll see this in when people need help in their gardens, is because there's too many ideas going on and it's too busy, and so it doesn't read together. So thinking about how the plants, do they look like they kind of communicate with each other? So that's just one thing to think about. Does it make your heart sing? Well, of course, that's one of the most important. You gotta love plants, and so if you have a favorite plant that you just absolutely love, well, why not have it in your garden? I'm not going to tell you no. Vine maples. So vine maples are just one of our native plants. It's an understory plant, but it's also an edge plant. It thrives in so many different environments, and it's an incredibly useful native plant. So it's one I use a lot. I don't know why this. So vine maple is an edgelord. Most people are going to get that. I'm taking this word back. Who knows what an edgelord is? They love the edge of a forest. They just absolutely thrive on the edge. So they are the lords of the edge. I've already talked about that. Yeah. So vine maples are actually like genetically like I don't know. It's like what we're genetically related to chimpanzees, like 99% something of our DNA. Well, vine maples are essentially almost like 99% related to Japanese maples. And so they have a very similar look. And so they probably came from the same region long time ago, back when Asia and North America were together. So, interesting fact. Plant selection, resiliency, so a lot of this stuff I've repeated, so I'm just going to click through this. Can adapt to well understood. So this is more about, when I'm talking about plant communities, creating plant communities in our gardens means thinking about how plants relate to each other. We just talked about that a bit. Escaping the contrastifolia model of design. Does anyone know what contrastifolia is? We got one. Johnny knows what it is. So there's nothing wrong with contrastifolia. It's basically just that it's a predominant mode of landscape design, which is just about texture, and like one plant has like purple foliage and another one has like yellow and another one, and everything kind of like is electric, and it can be really nice and cool, but it's not really a plant community visually, or I would say ecologically. And so I try to think about gardens more cohesively, so they kind of all read together. And so this is more of a inside baseball type stuff, but a different kind of aesthetic. So that's that, like getting away from what we think is the picturesque. Part of it is just looking at a site differently. Maybe, there's not flowers all different times in the year, but it can still be beautiful in different ways, and especially when it has a real connection to the place and it feels like it belongs there. This is what I was talking about earlier. Just plants from similar climates, they read well together, so no matter what part of the world they may come from. So a lot of plants from Mediterranean climates will do quite well in our climate in more south-facing sites. And they look like they belong in the same spot. So often they share similar adaptations to stress. So that can be part of it. Maybe they're also the right size and heights. And there's a book recommendation here, Plant-Driven Design by Scott and Laura Ogden. It's a book that really influenced me. If people are interested, that's the one plug I'll give. I gotta click through this. Okay, just a couple different site garden stories, which is the name of my company. So this is a project actually out in Hillsborough, and so this is often what I'm doing, is trying to have something more interesting than that. Tearing out the lawn and creating a whole new space. So this is the garden before. This is under construction. It's just like a mud. This is like in the wintertime, so it basically looks like a muddy mess. This is like when it's like looks the most severe and it's actually not very pretty, and it looks really raw, and like the land has been scarred, and plants actually will help heal the space. And so this is after maybe like a couple of years. So this is the front yard now, and then yeah, we essentially created more of a meadow. Use lots of natives, but these aren't all strictly natives. Meadows are really fun. One of my favorite landscapes, and to design as well, because they're just very. I'm really drawn towards grasses and just the movement and the texture. I think I took a video of this, and just the light little breeze is really nice to see all the texture and movement. So yeah, this is after it's finished. So again, it doesn't look as scarred. It looks a lot more interesting than that lawn. The client is actually a photographer, and so he sent me these really cool images, and I think he was enamored that there was like a little beetle on that marigold. So these are just some other gardens I've created. So this is one I just wanted to show you. So this is just like more of a tall perennial kind of prairie, and then leaving all that structure there allows you to have that in the wintertime. So I just thought that was cool when it snowed. It just captured all the different shapes of the flowers and grasses, and so there's a lot of beauty in that. And for the longest time, people thought that was pretty ugly and you should just chop it all down. So I'm here to tell you that you shouldn't chop it down. You should leave it. You can chop it down in the springtime, like in like late February, early March, when new growth starts to come down. So this is an example of just like urban gardens where there's not much plantable space. So if I was just going to use a strictly native plant palette, it wouldn't be that interesting. Partly because we don't have a lot of evergreen shrubs in our native plant palette. We have some, but not a lot of flowering ones. And so this is just a garden that has actually the client was drawn towards like Mexico, and like he wanted kind of this tropical thing, and so we just kind of had fun with this and got to use a lot of really interesting plants, and I'm sure this does actually have wildlife value or ecological value, much more than just a blank concrete patio. So okay, so we'll just quickly go through some plants that are my favorites. So Artistaphylos manzanitas. So these are upright manzanitas. So these are more native, like origin to. I mean, we do have some that are native to Oregon, mostly Southern Oregon, but also in Northern California and Southern California. But there's so many different Artistaphylos, and there's a lot of different cultivars now that are available. They've become much more since I have begun designing gardens. They've become much more common. They used to be kind of hard to find, and now I feel like they're almost everywhere. So this is after maybe like 10 years, and then you can prune it up and have this really nice park. And so it just has a long season of interest. And like when they flower, hummingbirds just love them and just will go nuts for them. And it's also like they flower generally in like the wintertime, January through March, depending on the variety and species. And so it adds some color and interest in a time when generally you don't have a lot of color in the garden. This is kind of like its peak flowering. It's still, yeah. This is a really cool, I love this one. It just has these clusters of hanging bells that I really like. And that upright kind of foliage. So is anyone familiar with this genus, Grevillea? This is mostly Australia plant. It's a proteaceae plant, and Some local nurseries like Sistis and Zara have introduced some that are cold hardy enough for our climate, and they thrive. And if you want a hummingbird magnet that blooms almost all year, maybe 10 months, this is a really great plant to have. You got to have space for it because they get quite large. But there's like a new species or variety every year that comes out. So definitely a recommendation. Our currants, I love ribes. This is definitely, some of these are selected for their ornamental appeal. So as horticulturalists, you can develop and not really breeding plants, but you're just selecting them for more aesthetic appeal. So there are varieties that have a little bit more intense of a flower, and so that white one, which is white lanterns, one of my favorites. I love that one. Stunning. If you love like intense white bloom.
Do those bloom for a long time or a short time?
They're, maybe like a month, 3 weeks. They're pendulous, so they just kind of keep coming on that, and slowly start to lose that. But they last at least a month, I would say. And they're also like really drought tolerant. So you can have these in full sun. I mean, they can be in shade. They're really adaptable. So this is definitely like I would call a climate proof or climate adapted plant as a native. Ceanothus, another wonderful plant, very resilient. They're not super long-lived, but the less you water it and the worse conditions you give it, the longer that it will live. So that's another kind of contradiction about certain plants. The more you give them, essentially the more obese they will get, and the shorter life they will have, much like us.
Would you say the more you give them, like fertilizing them and things like that?
Yeah. The better, the compost, fertilizer, water. They really like manzanita, ceanothus, a lot of native plants. They don't, unless we're talking about understory plants, they'll want like extra compost and fertilizer because they're more conditioned to an environment where there's a lot of biomass. But these plants are adapted to pretty nutrient deprived soils, and also adapted to drought. So they don't you can water them when you establish them the first couple summers, but leave them alone after that.
Can you trim them back, or is that?
Yeah, you can trim them back. So this Anchor Bay is more of a ground cover, and this one is cool because it's like hanging, so it's like a waterfall of color. The Blue Jeans is more like maybe 5 by 5, so that's a bit of a smaller size shrub. And then the Dark Star, and that's the typical larger ceanothus, can get quite large. So you definitely need a larger space.
Quite large in 2
Like
years,
8.
5 years?
Oh, like 5 years. They're fast growers because they fix nitrogen, so they're like, that's why they don't need any help. They're creating their own nutrients. So, but they're it's also looking at it. They're a pioneer species. So and they're adapted to fire. So after a fire, they're the first ones to grow out, and so they're kind of healing the land. Just some other favorites. Oh, ceanothus. We just talked about that. Why is that in there? It's because I like it so much. I had to repeat it. But this is a native iris, and then that is a. Does anyone know what that top plant is? I'm not asking Shawnee back there. Huh? Any guesses? That's a coast silk tassel. So that's it's actually an oak relative. Yeah, I guess they'll call it silk tassel. Really, so those are catkins. So it's much like an oak or a maple. Those catkins, they just happen to be very ornamental, and that's an evergreen shrub. It's again a larger shrub, but it can handle shade. It can handle drought. It can handle coastal. It's pretty adaptable. I've had them in different gardens before, and so I usually have one in every garden that I create. Not for my own, not for clients, but some other plants. We better wrap up. So just tea tree, clistamint. So these are all not native, but really adapted to drought. And these are more full sun plants. But if you want like just a bulletproof plant that you can plant out in like a health strip that doesn't need any water, these are all good selections. And that's it. Thank you. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, shoot. Go ahead.
Probably heresy. I have a small.
There's no heresy.
Like I have a small 50 by 100 foot lot, front yard only, 25 by 50. I've had it in a pretty formal garden, meaning a boxwood hedge, lawn, and my boxwood hedge got the blight. I'm in the process of tearing, and I'm thinking that I'm going to redo the whole thing. But I like the formal garden aspect, and it seems like the concept of going native is contrary to having a little bit of a formal garden.
Yeah.
And I was curious what you thought about kind of trying to make it adapted to a little bit more of a formal style garden.
Yeah, I mean, I like a decent amount of order in a garden because then it allows me to be more wild and free. So, and especially for like if it's like a front yard or like usable spaces that you're going to interact with on a regular basis, that's where we want more formality. But maybe like with the plant selection, you might open your mind about what you could use to create that formality, and it doesn't have to be like maybe a boxwood. It could be something that you could also hedge. But
I'm looking for some ideas to at least consider as a hedge kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't necessarily want to have be monos.
Right, yeah. That's another thing is like the hedgerow. I mean, it's very common in the west side of Portland. It's like the big hedgerow and privacy and stuff. So, you can be a pioneer and be like, I'm gonna have a different hedgerow, and it's gonna be a mix of like different native plants, and but you can still hedge it and stuff, and it might. So I like the idea of like creating like what are maybe old archetypes, but in a new way, and redefine it in a more 21st century.
Very much what I've been kind of trying to think through. How would I do that?
Yeah, so it's just kind of upgrading our models to a more 21st century mindset is maybe more approach to a formal garden. So that would be, and, if you want more specifics, you're gonna have to like have me out there and I can look at your garden. But
Would be going to a nurserer who specializes, like I have many of the plants you featured here, and this isn't a plug, but I go to Zera. And
yeah, they're.
Greg is very responsive. Have you ever, and
Sorry, I didn't hear it.
there's a small nursery on the east side, and
Yeah, it's called Zera Plants and
yeah.
Zera.
Xera.
And ask that nurserer, like in the case of a hedge, they'd probably be able to recommend a more sustainable, interesting plant for a hedge.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good advice. I'll just let her answer your question. No, yeah, Zera Plants and It's just they're definitely a great resource, and become kind of an institution for what I would call more climate appropriate landscaping and gardening, and so yeah, Greg, I've known Greg for a long time, and yeah, he's also very thoughtful and patient, and he'll give you all kinds of good tips and advice. So yes, we can plug Zara plants for.
Oh, someone from the YouTube chat asks.
Oh,
yeah, we have our live streamers.
Sure.
They asked, what do you think about clover as a lawn replacement, and does it need to be mowed?
Well, I know that there's different types of clover, and then also like lawn mixes that incorporate clover, but it's not like it's like micro clover. Yeah, I'm kind of ambivalent about those. I think some work really well. I've seen some like escape or just not look great or whatever. So just depends on the mix. But yeah, it is a good option for if you want something that's not strictly just like ryegrass or fescue. But there are different seed blends that you can get. You can also just like not use any kind of like grass seed mix. You could do something that's just low growing, and that often like a lawn is just a negative space. It's just a space where the eye can rest. I mean, if it's more functional, then you want something that you can actually step on. But I don't know if I answered that question, but
So
go ahead.
We have about a half an acre,
Okay.
and we've been loving it for about 30 years. And in the last, I want to say 4,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like the plants, where they used to grow 10% every year or so on, they've been doubling pretty much every year. So we're now at a point where everything is overgrown, and plants are now, 5 years ago were 3 feet tall, or now 20, and they're getting broader. And so the question that I have for you is if you have any recommendations on how to think about removing plants to help either allow those big ones to continue to thrive, and not have to prune everything back to 0 every year.
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of gardens end up. The thing about like landscape design is that it's never finished when the plants are installed, and so the element of time always kind of comes into play. So a good design thinks about that, but also you need a designer or a good gardener to help guide the vision over time as plants change, and plants they're not predictable. So but often if things are like overgrown in a lot of different areas, it means that maybe the right plant wasn't selected for that particular space. And sometimes it does require removing or just editing. So it's hard to answer specific questions about people's properties, but I would just say that you could maybe like thoughtfully edit a space without having to start over or something, and maybe as long as you're not having to prune something like so much where it's just like constant work, that's when I would say that it's not the right plant for the space. But yeah, so someone with a good eye and good horticultural knowledge, and often like as a designer, I don't want to like leave like these young children just to grow up on themselves. And I get pretty attached to them. So I often tell my clients, make sure to check in with me 1 year, 2 years, 3 years out, because that's really like when the garden's going to establish, and that's when you can kind of make decisions to at an earlier time before things might tip the balance to the point where you have to make more drastic decisions. So, yeah. So, anyone else? Anyone from the interwebs? Thanks for tuning in, people out there on the web. Hopefully this was interesting, informative, electric, none of the above. Thank you all for coming.